Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for this online seminar, Pioneers and Pearlers, Japanese Migrants in Western Australia, delivered from the National Archives of Australia WA office. Before we start, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are presenting from today, the Whadjuk people, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Amelia, and this is Taryn. We are archival officers here at the National Archives, and today we'll each be presenting snapshots of the lives of a few of the Japanese women and men who migrated to the northern towns of Western Australia during the early 20th century. We'll give accounts of their arrivals to Australia and provide glimpses into their working and family lives, their contributions to the community, as well as the struggles they face living in Australia. We stumbled upon these records and these stories in our day-to-day work with the National Archives records. The collection holds Australian government records created by the various Commonwealth agencies and departments. They show how government records have touched almost every aspect of our lives. We have some time for questions at the end of our presentation, so please feel free to put them in the chat window. There should be an email address at the top where you can send any questions that you might have. Hopefully we'll get to all of the questions, but we might run out of time. I'd also just like to advise before we begin that some of the language found in the records from these time periods could be considered discriminatory and do not reflect our own views or those of the National Archives. Records show that by the early 1870s, Japanese people were visiting Australia. From 1888, the mainland colonies enacted laws against Chinese immigration and naturalisation, and by the 1890s, the presence of Japanese workers, especially in the pearling industries in Northern Australia, started to cause concern, and by 1896, the colonies decided to impose restrictive immigration laws. In 1901, the new Parliament passed the Immigration Restriction Act, which was grounded in restrictive laws already in place, with the addition of the dictation test. This was despite the fact a number of immigrants had already settled in Australia, getting married, starting families and businesses. In 1904, after negotiations with the Japanese government, an amendment was passed that allowed merchants, students and tourists come into Australia for up to 12 months. With this amendment, trading networks grew between Australia and Japan. However, with Japan's entry into the war in 1941, Australia seized assets, including the homes, businesses and finances, and interned the Japanese immigrant population and frequently their families. Most Japanese internees were sent back to Japan in 1946, regardless of where they had been living before the war or how long they had been living in Australia. In the 1950s, although immigration policies were still strict, responding to demand, the government gave the pearling industry permits to employ experienced Japanese divers and granted permission to the entry of the wives and fiancés of Australian servicemen and eventually granted them citizenship. The stories we will explore today all share a common element in that they tell us about the effect of the 1901 legislation on individuals building lives in Australia. During this presentation, we'll use the name order of given name, family name. When there are multiple family members, we'll use first names for disambiguation. The first person I'd like to introduce you to is globetrotting businesswoman Toyo Tokumaru. The records reveal that she worked in partnership with her husband Shingoro in the family business. Then when he died, successfully ran the business as the proprietor, which I think is pretty cool for the period. She was born in Nagasaki in June of either 1869 or 1870 and first came to Australia at the end of 1895, 5 years after her husband, when she was around 25 years old. The records tell us that she was working and living in Broome into the early 20th century. Tokumaru obtained this certificate of exemption from the dictation test in 1910 when she was 36 years old. The certificate would allow her to return to Australia from overseas without undergoing the mandatory dictation test. You can see Tokumaru's handprint on the right-hand side. Immigration officers would compare the handprints on the traveller's return to verify the name on the certificate matched the passenger. A tool of the White Australia policy, the dictation test was designed to be failed, and doing so could see travellers fined, imprisoned or even deported. These certificates were usually valid for about 3 years. When Tokumaru first arrived in the latter half of the 1890s, the pearling industry was booming in the northern towns of Western Australia, and Broome was the centre of pearling activities. Toyo Tokumaru was one of a very small number of Japanese women in Western Australia, with census data indicating only approximately 209 Japanese women in Western Australia in 1901. Her alien registration documents list her occupation as storekeeper, but it seems that she was more like an unofficial co-partner and then the owner of the successful Tokomoto Brothers general store, a long-lived institution in the town. The store sold a huge range of goods, many of which were imported, mostly from Japan and Singapore. The Tokumarus also seem to have been involved, at least initially, in the pearling business as agents, managing indenture contracts of divers, and they may have also provided money lending services at some point. This is another advertisement for Tokumaru Brothers. This one is from 1913. It says here that they were the sole agents for the champagne cider, an alkaline water, beneficial to health and an excellent summer drink. The business catered to a variety of needs, as we can see here. We know from the records that they created made-to-measure kimono, and they had Japanese dressmakers working there. One of the dressmakers was Ishii Umeda, the wife of shop assistant, then assistant manager, Nobutaro Umeda. The ad on the right here gives us a sense of the range of goods that they stocked. It simply states, if you want it, ring up. The ads are really great. I can talk about them from the rest of the presentation. Excuse me. The store was established by Toyo's husband, Shingoro, and his brother, Kamejiro. This is Shingoro in 1910. He first came to Australia in 1890 and set up the business. He was active in the Japanese community and he was president of the Broome Japan Society for a few terms. Shingoro moved to Perth to study English to improve his business prospects, and lived there for about 2 years from 1898 to 1900. He applied for naturalisation during this time, but he was rejected on the grounds of his race. Toyo and her husband Shingoro had an adopted son, Buntaro, who we know that lived in Broome for at least a short time, around 1918, when he was 15 years old. This is Broome circa 1915. It's possibly a photograph of Carnarvon Street. The Tokumarus moved their store to larger premises on this street in 1915, right next to the Roebuck Bay Hotel. However, not long after the move, Toyo's husband Shingoro died. He was 44 and died from beriberi on his rubber plantation in Singapore in December 1916. Although her husband died without a will, Toyo was able to pursue ownership of the business. She succeeded in inheriting the store, including the land, and continued running the enterprise in Broome after her husband's death. In his probate documents, Toyo is credited with expanding and improving the business. She frequently travelled to Japan, as we can see from her certificates of exemption. We've got one from 1910, 1918, which is the one that you can see here, and also from 1920. She may have travelled more often, we just don't have those records. Toyo commissioned goods to be purchased in Japan and had them shipped to Australia. During the First World War, when it became difficult to ship wares directly, she had them moved via Singapore and then reconsigned to Australia. She also had her brother-in-law, Kamejiro, buy her goods for the store in Singapore. The Tokumaru Brothers store also gave back to the local community. They're recorded in newspapers as making donations to various charities. These include the Red Cross in 1915 and a local X-ray fund in 1924. This is the final certificate of exemption the National Archives holds for Tokumaru from 1920. It sees her at age 50, seeking another exemption to return to Australia from Japan. Toyo died 4 years later due to asthma on the 26th of November 1924. She died in Oita City, which was her husband's hometown. At the time of her death, she was the sole owner of the Tokomoto Brothers general store business, and her estate in Broome was valued at £7,316. I think this is the equivalent of about $830,000 in contemporary money. She bequeathed her entire estate, including the buildings and the land, to her adopted son Buntaro, who remained in Japan. During her illness and after her death, the store was managed by their longtime business manager and bookkeeper, Nobutaro Umeda, who I mentioned earlier. He started winding down the business really soon after that. Due to a decline in trade towards the end of 1925, a number of local Japanese-owned businesses decided to join their capital and stock together and form a new company. They called the new company Tonan Shokai, which they translated in the records as the Southern Trading Company. The Tokumaru Brothers stock was put into the new amalgamation. The store in Broome was vacated in January 1926. The premises were not vacant for long, and the new tenants were London pearl diving suit manufacturers Heinke & Co. The next person I want to introduce you to is Tokuichi Kinjo. His story reveals the perils of life as a pearl diver. From the 1880s until its decline in the late 1950s, with the exception of the war years, the pearl shell business, centred in the north of the state, was one of the most lucrative marine industries in Australia. Japanese workers were indispensable to pearling operations, and businesses such as Heinke & Co. supplied the latest pearl diving equipment to the divers in Broome. Tokuichi Kinjo came to Australia from Okinawa in 1957 when he was 27 years old. He was an engineer, but he was hired on an indenture to work as a diver in the pearling industry. An indenture meant he was contracted for 3 years to a particular pearling company. Indentures were designed to employ foreign labour, with the recruitment usually happening overseas. The contracts usually came with very tight restrictions on the workers. On this form from 1957, Kinjo's application for registration by an alien entering Australia, his nationality has been given as Japanese, though his country of birth is listed as the Ryukyu Islands. He's also described in other immigration documents as being Ryukyuan. Although they don't technically describe the same thing, Ryukyu is often used interchangeably with Okinawa, and it describes the chain of island that stretches from Japan's southernmost island, Kyushu, almost to Taiwan. The vast majority of indentured pearl divers in northwestern Australia were from Wakayama-ken in Japan, where there were many fishing communities and also abalone divers. However, in the late 1950s, pearling companies sought more and more Okinawan pearl divers. From the end of the Second World War until 1972, Okinawa was governed by the United States Civil Administration. So, on a technicality, the workers employed from Okinawa could be considered as not being from Japan. The issues are complex, but one of the main reasons the pearling companies used this strategy was, according to academic researcher Dr. Yuriko Nagata, was as a way of avoiding issues with the prevalent post-war anti-Japanese sentiment. On both of these forms here, you can see that Tokuichi's nationality is given as Ryukyuan in the top right-hand corner there, in both of the forms. Pearl diving was low-paid, hard, and dangerous work. Kinjo's 3-year contract seems to have gone well, but right at the end of his indenture, sometime at the end of November 1960, catastrophe struck. According to reports, he had been diving some distance off Broome at a depth of 31 metres when an accident happened. He was admitted to hospital with diver's paralysis, which we know today as decompression sickness, otherwise known as the bends. This letter from customs officials at Broome to the Migration Office reads, "You are advised that the above-named Ryukyuan pearling operative employed by D. McDaniel & Son was admitted to Royal Perth Hospital on the 7th of December for treatment for diver's paralysis. It is expected that a considerable period in hospital will be required, after which it's likely he will be repatriated." Kinjo was hospitalized alongside another fisheries worker, Shunji Koyachi. He's the one lying down in the photograph. He was only 19 and working on a tuna boat when he was crushed between two blocks of ice. Kinjo and Koyachi are shown here giving a Japanese vase to Akiko and Stan Chester, who supported the two injured men while they were in hospital. The vase was from the Japanese Seamen's Union, a thank you gift to the Chesters for visiting the two men in hospital, bringing them Japanese dishes and helping with translation. And according to this newspaper article, Kinjo had been planning to return to Japan and get married before his accident. The two men remained in hospital in the Shenton Park Annex paraplegic unit for 6 months until they were both repatriated to Japan together with a medical escort in June 1961. Kinjo was left disabled by the illness, possibly as a paraplegic. He was assessed by the Pearling Company's insurers as having 100% permanent disability and was given a total of £3,018, which was the maximum compensation they awarded at the time. Masataro Okumura was also a pearl diver. His records tell the story of his struggle to stay in Australia with his family. Born on the 31st of October 1917 in Taiji, which is now Broome's sister city, in Wakayama-ken, Okumura Masataro was from a family of fishermen. As I previously mentioned, the vast majority of Japanese indentured pearl divers working in northwestern Australia were from Wakayama. He first came to Australia when he was only 20 years old on the ship the Gorgon in April 1937 and was indentured to the pearling company A.C. Gregory. 4 years later, Okumura was just embarking on a new pearling contract when Japan entered World War II. He was interned as an enemy alien in December 1941 alongside most of the other Japanese people who had been living in Australia at the time. This group included naturalised subjects and Australian-born wives and children of Japanese men. After being held in the prison in Broome, he was taken south to Woodman's Point. He was then interned at Loveday Camp in South Australia. Shortly after, when his status and that of many of the civilian Japanese pearlers was changed from internee to prisoner of war, he was moved to Hay Internment Camp in New South Wales in June 1943. On his official documents, Okumura accounts for this time by saying he was working in rural areas of New South Wales. So he must have been one of the internees who opted to take up work outside the camp during their internment. Okumura was released in 1946, and almost 10 years after he arrived in Australia, was repatriated to Japan. In the same year, he married Chizuko Kondo in his hometown of Taiji. Okumura stayed in Japan until he was granted permission to return to Australia as a pearling specialist in 1953. He was 35 years old. He appears to have separated from Chizuko by this time, and his forms list him as single. He was contracted to the company M&W Scott of Broome. Pearling companies like this were given special exemptions from the Immigration Act to bring skilled labourers into Australia for limited periods of time. Okumura was an experienced pearler and must have been an industrious and valuable worker, as his company successfully sought the renewal of his exemption several times. While living and working in Broome, Okumura formed a relationship with a local woman and started a family. So in January 1961, when his contract with the pearling company was about to terminate, which would require him to go back to Japan, Okumura applied for a free status so that he could stay and seek employment in Australia as a permanent resident. He was living with his partner, Mary Albert, who was, according to an article by the ABC, a First Nations Bardi woman from the Dampier Peninsula, and their 4 children. As part of his application for residency, the Catholic priest at Broome testified to Okumura's good character. However, his application to stay with his family hit difficulties. The immigration department initially wouldn't grant him extra time, and he needed the time to supply them with information about his previous marriage and about his and Mary Albert's children. Despite having a family, the Immigration Department ordered his employers to repatriate him. All pearlers who were not re-engaged in contracts were required to be sent home by the 14th of February each year. In a last-minute letter marked urgent towards the end of February, the officials at Broome informed the department that Okumura had been in Australia before the war and had been interned in New South Wales. The next month, a West Australian immigration officer sought advice from Canberra as to whether or not his previous residence and wartime internment might add special consideration to his application for residency. This telegram arrived from Canberra a week later, informing the officer that because Okumura had lived a total of 15 years in Australia, he was eligible to apply for permanent residence and was free from his obligations to the pearling company. That time he was interned during World War II had contributed to those 15 years and meant he could now apply for a job where he liked. However, the road was still not smooth for Okumura and his family. Although he had been granted some time to stay and make his application for residence, there were 4 conditions that he had to fulfill, one of which was having, and I'm quoting from the documents, an adequate knowledge of English so that he could procure without great difficulty his everyday requirements. In August 1961, the Immigration Department sent out an officer to interview him and report back. Immigration policy at the time was very focused on assimilation, and the customs officer thought Okumura's prospects on that front would be hampered by his level of English. This was despite the fact that he was described as being most industrious and was also supporting a family of 5. The officer reported, however, that because of the, quote, peculiar conditions in Broome, he would be able to find work, presumably among other Japanese-speaking labourers. Despite the officer's recommendation that Okumura would make, again I'm quoting, a good Australian citizen, his application was denied once more and he was told to improve his level of English. He was given until April the next year to reapply for residence. A memo in his file, written by the officer at the end of August 1961, states that Okumura had found work among Australians, and this would no doubt lead to an improvement in his English. The next year in March, the immigration officer was again sent out to interview Okumura. The report from this visit describes him as working regularly with Australian lumpers, offloading pearling boats, and also that he was living with Mary Albert and their children. Crucially, the officer reports that Okumura's English had improved a little and was sufficient for him to procure his necessities. Happily, on the 3rd of May 1962, a letter was sent to Okumura informing him that his application had been approved and he could stay in Australia with his family. We know that he was still living in Broome up until at least 1986. So they're the snapshots that I'll present today, and now I'd like to hand over to Taryn now to share some more stories about Japanese migration to Australia.
Thank you, Amelia. I'll just get my PowerPoints going. Okay, so another well-known Japanese businessman was Jiro Muramatsu, and this story explores some of the struggles he faced in Australia despite his prominent standing in Australia's pearling industry. Sorry, my light has just gone out in here. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. Jiro arrived at Broome, Western Australia in September 1893 on board the Saladin. He stayed in Broome for 5 months before moving to Cossack, Western Australia. As a young boy, he moved from Cossack to Melbourne, where he attended St Francis Xavier College and achieved outstanding results in mathematics, bookkeeping, and music. A few years later, following the death of his father, Jiro and his brother Santaro took over the family store and pearl shell business in Cossack, and they renamed it JNT Miramax. Jiro appears to have anglicised his name by dropping the U. He is listed under Miramax in the records held by the National Archives. In 1905, he married Hatsu Noguchi, and in 1913 they had a daughter named Marie Haru. By 1915, JNT Miramax was a well-known and successful pearling company in the Cossack area, and the firm owned most of the freehold properties in the town. The company held the majority of the issued permits for indentured labourers in the port of Cossack, as well as 10 pearling luggers. Jiro Muramatsu and his family took multiple trips to Japan between 1918 and 1926. He was required to apply for a certificate of exemption from the dictation test for each of these journeys. Jiro had become a naturalised Australian at age 22 in the colony of Victoria. However, in May 1923, his request to have his name added to the Commonwealth electoral roll was rejected. He immediately made an appeal to the High Court of Australia. In 1923, when Jiro applied to be enrolled in the Commonwealth electoral roll, the electoral officer had refused. In spite of his name already being included on the state electoral roll, he was disqualified from voting by the Electoral Act 1907 by reason of being, and this is a quote, an Aboriginal native of Asia or the Pacific Islands, and this nullified his rights as a naturalised citizen. Jiro's appeal to the High Court of Australia argued that he was not an Aboriginal of Japan and that he was entitled to vote. In the court records, his argument outlined that the Ainus, a tribe of immigrants who crossed over from northeastern Asia to Japan, were historically considered the Aboriginal inhabitants of Japan, and he was not a descendant of them. His appeal was dismissed by the magistrate, who stated that a man of Japanese-born race, born in Japan, must, in the absence of evidence, be held to be an Aboriginal native of Asia. Aboriginal at the time was defined as any person dwelling in any country before the arrival of later European colonists. In 1928, Jiro Muramatsu left Cossack with the majority of his pearling fleet, transferring the company's main office to Darwin. Jiro continued to manage his father's store and pearling business in Cossack. Between 1930 and 1933, the federal government restricted pearling in Darwin, and during this time, the Western Australian shell market took a nosedive due to competition from other countries such as Japan. The Commonwealth government could not exercise any control over the Japanese competition, who had around 100 boats off Darwin fishing for pearl shell. This drew prices down and production in the area began to decline due to the exploitation of pearl beds. By 1938, the Broome pearling industry, supported by the Premier of WA, put forward a request for financial assistance to the Department of Commerce. The Commonwealth Government granted an advance of £30 per tonne on 200 tonnes of pearl shell at Darwin and £87 per tonne at Broome, so that the pearlers would be able to continue fishing and paying wages. In December 1941, Jiro and his wife Hatsu were captured at Darwin as enemy subjects, and in 1942 they were interned across the country and in Tatura internment camp in Victoria. Luckily, their daughter Marie was living in Japan at the time, having married in 1935. All of the Miramax assets in Darwin and Cossack were seized under the National Security Enemy Property Regulations, and this included their luggers, pearls, as well as the family home in Darwin. The property statement records at the National Archives detail every single item within the home that was seized, and this included cutlery, kimonos, and even some of the nuts and bolts in the back shed. On January 11, 1943, after 3 months at the hospital next to the internment camp, Jiro Muramatsu passed away from stomach cancer. His will named his widow Hatsu, who was still interned at Tatura, as his sole beneficiary. She was finally released in 1946 and travelled back to Perth. As Jiro had been naturalised, Hatsu was considered British by marriage, so the assets seized on their internment were released. Unfortunately, this came too late as the Muramatsu residence on Kavanagh Street in Darwin had been bombed and dismantled during the couple's internment. Hatsu Muramatsu returned to Cossack, where she was virtually the last resident until 1957, which was when she returned to Japan to live with her daughter. Another well-known family in the Cossack and Broome areas were the Murakamis. Yasukichi Murakami was a photographer and pioneer with his diving dress designs. Mr. Murakami worked as a storekeeper in Cossack for his friend and professional photographer Takazo Nishioka. Working alongside Nishioka, Mr. Murakami developed an interest in photography and took photographs of the people of Cossack and Broome. When Takazo Nishioka passed away in 1901, his wife Eki took over the business, and she was also a skilled photographer. The State Library of Western Australia has a beautiful collection of photographs taken by Mr. Murakami and Eki, which feature in some of the next slides. This photograph shows Murakami and Eki sitting outside Nishioka's Emporium on Carnarvon Street in Broome. The pair married and worked together until Eki's death in the early 1900s. Mr. Murakami later remarried Teresa Morata from Cossack, and the couple had 9 children. He managed the Dampier Hotel and was president of the Japanese Society in Broome from 1921. In this photograph, he is dressed in the white suit in front of the hotel. Mr. Murakami was also a passionate inventor, and he had his own lugger for pearl diving suit experiments and research. He was close friends with Captain Ansel Gregory, who owned a large pearling fleet which operated across the north of Australia. In 1926, Mr. Murakami submitted a diving dress design to the Commonwealth of Australia patents attorney Richard Sparrow for patent. His diving dress design would enable divers to work at great depths for longer periods of time with greater personal comfort and safety. Air supply through a mouthpiece, rather than filling the entire suit, meant that less weights needed to be attached to keep the diver submerged. Diving dresses at the time had air circulating through the entire suit, which meant the exhaled air mixed with fresh air. Using Mr. Murakami's design, there was no extra air within the suit, and the helmet with the mask fitted internally had a hinged window for visibility. According to researcher and photographer Mayu Kanamori, who I believe might be attending today, Mr. Murakami's son Joe tells us that his father was invited by Heinke & Co., manufacturers of the traditional diving dress, to London to develop a prototype of his design. But for some reason, he never went. In the 1940s, Mr. Murakami and his family moved to Darwin, where they lived in the back of a photography shop. In 1941, he and his wife, as well as 5 of their children, were captured and interned as enemy aliens. Mr. Murakami was suspected of being a Japanese agent, as he was frequently seen in the company of Japanese masters of pearling luggers. It was alleged that he had assumed and travelled under the name of Chojiro Araki, which was actually his mother-in-law's maiden name, and he was labelled a suspected spy. Multiple photographic negatives were seized from his photography shop, as they infringed the control of photography order in place at the time. The subject matter of the images included wharves, ships, military camps, and guns, although Mr. Murakami assured officers he only developed negatives on behalf of his clients. These were not his own photographs. Mr. Murakami, his wife, and their children were interned at Tatura internment camp in Victoria, which was the same camp where Jiro and Hatsu Muramatsu were interned. This photograph shows Jiro Muramatsu visiting the Japanese cemetery with Teresa Murakami and 3 of her children prior to their internment. On the 13th of June 1944, Mr. Murakami was admitted to the camp hospital after suffering a heart attack. He unfortunately died 13 days later. His wife and children remained at the camp until October 1946, when the family was released into the care of the Clontarf Boys Town in Victoria Park, Western Australia. Internment is a major part of Japanese history in Australia, and by 1945, there were roughly 3,000 Japanese still interned across the country. Whether this number takes into account the number of naturalised Japanese, such as the Muramatsu family, is undetermined. By 1946, the Australian government had stated its policy that all Japanese nationals, residents or not, were to be repatriated. In February 1946, Mrs. Josephine Tanaka begged on behalf of her husband, Tatsui Tanaka, for permission for him to remain in Australia despite his Japanese nationality. Josephine was a British subject, born in Ireland, and the couple had been married for 14 years. Their 2 children had been living in an orphanage while Josephine worked hard, struggling to keep their laundry business in Sydney afloat. Tatsui Tanaka was 60 years old and had lived in Australia for over 40 years. He is recorded as the first Japanese national to be released from internment in Australia and not be repatriated. By 1947 census, there were only 85 foreign-born Japanese remaining in Australia. Just 2 months prior to the outbreak of World War II, Australian Customs began tracking the arrivals and mass departures of Japanese, particularly through Western Australia's northern ports. Toshio Fukuda, his wife Rita, and their 2 children, Kenneth and David, were among those departing Australia in 1941 to travel back to Japan. The family lived in Broome, where Toshio was the secretary of the Japanese club and was well known in the community. The family stayed in Japan, unable to return until the peace treaty between Australia and Japan was signed. A letter written by Rita was published in the Virgilia's Friendly Corner section of the Western Mail in September 1951, in which she thanked her Australian friends for sending her copies of the newspaper. She wrote, "It is my link with my hometown. I really do miss the Aussies." By 1941, the Second World War saw the pearling industry all but cease in Western Australia's northwest. Soon after the end of the war, as demand for pearl shell grew, pearling companies began their efforts lobbying for support to reopen the industry. The first post-war pearling lugger set sail in March 1946. It was crewed by a group of Malay pearlers and owned by the company Streeter and Mail. The industry was so desperate for workers that many non-British men who were serving in the Australian military forces in Perth were discharged in order to help the industry's labour shortage. The men, upon discharge, would become prohibited migrants and would be returned to their native countries. So the only way they could stay in Australia was to work as divers, treacherous work for which they received little pay. By January 1950, there was a shortage of labourers willing to work on the pearling luggers in Broome, and as Amelia mentioned earlier, Okinawan pearl divers were in high demand. In 1952, Malcolm Scott, Senator for Western Australia, wrote to the Prime Minister to explain the dire situation facing the waning industry. He noted that when operating before the war, the best divers came from Japan. He said, "They are able to go deeper and stay down for longer periods than other races, Malays and Indonesians appear incapable of training divers, and as the older men go out, there are no new men to take their place. He suggested that the only way to satisfy production demands would be for the government to allow the Japanese to return to Australia, which would get the benefit of urgently needed dollars. Senator Scott relayed that the Broome Shellers Association would appreciate it very much if the government would give approval immediately for the importation of up to 35 men to work the year's pearling season. If 4 boats could be manned by Japanese crews, they would fish approximately 120 tons of shell, representing 175,000 urgently needed dollars. Changes were made to allow Japanese workers to return to Australia, and in 1953, Toshio Fukuda and 37 Japanese pearl divers who had previously been employed in Broome returned to Australia. Toshio, now an agent for the Kiko Busan Company of Tokyo, had arranged 3-year contracts for the men at the request of Australian pearling companies. However, there were reports that 3 Darwin hotels had refused to provide accommodation for these divers. Flights of Japanese pearling specialists began to arrive to Australia, and the industry slowly began to bounce back. Rita Fukuda returned to Broome with Toshio frequently in the 1960s and the 1980s. Our final stories unfold around the admission of Japanese wives and fiancés of Australian servicemen during the early 1950s. On March 27, 1952, the Menzies government granted permission for Japanese wives and fiancés of Australian servicemen to enter Australia. Nobuko Sakuramoto, later known as Cherry Parker, was the first to arrive in 1952. Cherry's family home in Hiroshima was destroyed by the atomic bomb in August 1945. So, in 1946, with food still desperately scarce, she took a job as a housemaid at the Australian Army camp in nearby Kuri. It was here where she met Gordon Parker, a medical orderly from Victoria, who she married in 1948. And these photographs show Cherry at her Australian citizenship ceremony in 1957. Upon hearing that Japanese wives could now be permitted to enter Australia, Reginald John Weyland of the Australian Regular Army submitted an application for his Japanese-born wife and child. Iko Fukuoka and Reginald Weyland had been married in Hiroshima in 1948, and their son, John Robert Weyland, was just 3 years old. The application process was lengthy, and there were many factors that could prevent a Japanese wife from coming to Australia. A security check was performed by the Chief of the Kuri Municipal Police on behalf of the Australian government, and as Iko had spent many years employed as a nurse at the Hiroshima hospital, she was a satisfactory candidate. Permission was eventually granted for the pair to travel to Australia, and they arrived at Sydney on board the New Australia on April 8, 1953. By 1956, the occupation of Japan had ended and Japanese wives were allowed to become permanent Australian citizens. Iko Weyland obtained citizenship in June 1957, and her son John Robert was granted citizenship by descent. In our seminar today, we've shared just a few of the brief snapshots of the successes and struggles faced by Japanese migrants in Australia. There are many other records to be found in the National Archives that show how ordinary people were affected by government decisions. If you are interested in finding out more about Japanese migrants in Western Australia, you can submit a reference inquiry via our website, give us a call, and we've got some links in the chat which you can use to contact us. We supplemented our background historical information for this talk from this research guide, which is called Allies, Enemies and Trading Partners, Records on Australia and the Japanese, written by Pam Oliver. It lists records held at the National Archives on Australians' relations with the people and government of Japan, and it can actually be downloaded as a free PDF on our website. Our research was also supplemented with information from the records held by the State Records Office of Western Australia and photographs by the State Library of Western Australia. So the National Archives has offices in almost every state, and our Northbridge Research Centre is open for anyone who would like to view original records. We also have an exhibition on at the moment for anyone in Western Australia, which goes till the end of October, and it's called Lasting Impressions. That's the end of our presentation today, but we'll be happy to answer any questions if people want to pop them in the chat. So, and I'd just like to thank you all for joining us for this webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Annette.
Yeah, thank you. We'll probably stick around for about 5 minutes if anyone would like to pop questions in the chat, and we can try and answer them for you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yes, I think there will be a recording available, and we're happy to pass on our actual PowerPoint presentation as well. Oh, people from Broome, yes, yeah.
Welcome, Broome. Oh, those books sound good. What kind of topics are they on? Rate books, I get it. Okay, great. Thanks, Alison.
Oh, rate books, yeah. Oh, from Karatha, hello. Yes, no worries, Taylor. Sure, Sylvia, we can send that through, no problem. Yeah, that would be great, Alison. We'll have to maybe give you an email after the session.
Hi, Annette. Your question, anything on their homes? Do you mean what happened to their homes after repatriation in 1946, or was there some other specific question that you had?
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Kylie. Yes, we do. We do have some school groups. If you would like to send through some questions about it through the events address we put up the top there, that would be fabulous. We're always, sorry, Annette, we can't hear you. We're always interested in looking into sharing National Archives information with students, definitely. Yeah, so it's Events WA, which is up the top there. So we look forward to your email.
Annette, perhaps if you sent an email with some details of what you're after, we could respond to you in more detail a bit later. There should be an email just at the top of the chat. Does that sound okay? We have all the mics and cameras disabled.
Yeah, so I think that was Amelia's section about the gentleman who was married to the Indigenous lady. Do you remember who that was, Amelia?
Yeah, that's Masataro Okumura. Do you want me to, actually, what I should do is probably write it in the chat.
Thanks, Alison. Okay, Judy, that sounds like an interesting one. A model of a lugger. Wow, okay. That'd be something I'd love to see. You can definitely send an inquiry through to us and we'll have a search and see if we can find anything related. And the website's just up the top there if you want to send that through, or to our email address would be great. Oh, thank you, Mayu. I'll take that down. That's fabulous. I'll send you an email after this. Oh, yes, and we've got Kylie at the Broome Museum. I'll put the address in there.
Thanks, Taryn.
So yes, send anything through to that and we'll happily answer any questions. Any other questions? Oh wow, near Love Day.
Yeah,
Okay.
wow.
Yeah.
I don't think there's too much left of the original site, is there? There's just some concrete pads and maybe some external walls. I just saw some pictures. Be great to visit.
Mm. Oh, who designed the Japanese cemetery? I'm not sure off the top of my head, but we could definitely, that's probably a question for someone in Broome or Cossack, but we could definitely have a bit of a search and see if there's anything we can find about it. Not sure, Annette.
Thanks, Judy. That must be really interesting. I wonder if many people go to visit the site.
Mm.
That's right. Yeah, they were woodcutters. Yeah, for the boilers and other things. I think they got to go to some pretty remote places on the water, on the river out there, which sound really beautiful. Tough job though.
Okay, wow. And this was a model boat, wasn't it, that you were? Yeah.
Thanks, Yolande. Sorry if I've got that pronunciation wrong. We do digitize records on demand. We examine them first to see if they're open. The cost depends on the size of the record. We've also prioritized some record groups which we're digitizing as a project, and so they're being digitized as we go along.
Thanks, Taylor. That's great. Yeah, that would be great, Judy, if you want to send that through. It sounds really interesting.
Thanks, Annette. Yeah, I actually do think there were cultural at the camps. They were allowed to celebrate things like the Emperor's birthday, and I do actually think that there were theatre performances and art shows and things like that happening. If that's what you're talking about with the internment camps. I think one of the camps had their own currency. It wasn't by the Japanese internees, but yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, that's a whole nother talk in itself, isn't it? Internment. Such an interesting subject.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah, definitely, Judy. Sounds great. All right, well, we might sign off if no one has any further questions. And if you do have any further questions, please feel free to email them through to our events inbox. But thank you all for coming. It's been great. I hope you all enjoyed it and found it interesting and learned something.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. It was real fun.
All right, thank you. Bye.